share knowledge and good practice between destinations and with organisations involved with transport policy or provision and support the development and promotion of sustainable leisure travel across the UK. And without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Emily, Jane and Samantha, and they can introduce themselves.
Great, thanks Nick. Morning everybody. Thanks for inviting us to speak today. Delighted to be able to give you an insight into one of our first transport initiatives here in Loch Lomond, the Trossachs National Park, the Trossachs Explorer shuttle bus, which has been delivered as a pilot over the last 2 years. So just to kick us off, introductions. I'm Emily Davie, National Park Mobility Partnership Manager. I'm really responsible for working with our partners and stakeholders looking to transform the transport network here in the park. I've been project managing the Trossachs Explorer over the last 2 years. It's one of my first projects since I joined, supported by the wider team here at the park, officers from Stirling Council, and in the first year supported by Jane and Sam on the evaluation. So I'll hand over to Jane just to introduce yourself.
Hi there, yes, I'm Jane Johnstone and I'm a lecturer at the University of Strathclyde in marketing and tourism. So yeah, I'm involved in the evaluation of the pilot, which I'll tell you about very soon.
And Sam?
Hello, I'm Sam Murdy. I am an associate professor or reader in the UK. So I'm now at ACU in Australia, but I was at Strathclyde University prior to this, and Jen and I work on these similar styles of projects. Thank you.
Great, so in terms of today's talk, I'm going to cover the background to the pilot, introduce the concept of the Trossachs Explorer, outline its evolution from year 1 into year 2, and look at some of our long-term ambitions around sort of opportunities and challenges with delivering this moving forward. Jane and Sam will talk through the evaluation they undertook during the first year of the pilot, which has really been fundamental to demonstrating its impact and inspiring future services. So for those not familiar, Loch Lomond, the Trossachs National Park, is located in the central belt of Scotland. It's the 4th largest national park in the UK, and one of 2 in Scotland, with the other being Cairngorms National Park to the north. 50% of Scotland's population actually live within 1 hour's drive of the national park, so that makes it a really popular destination for as many domestic visitors as much as it is for international visitors. And the park is really sort of split into 4 distinct areas. We've got Loch Lomond in the centre, which is probably the best known area of the park, Cowal to the west, Breadalbane to the north, and Trossachs to the east, which is where the Trossachs Explorer is located as a service. So why is transport important for us here at the National Park? We have a small population. There's approximately 15,000 people that actually live here, but we see very high visitor numbers throughout the year. Approximately 5 million people come and visit the park each year, and the majority of those visitors travel by car. So in an area with very limited public transport options, we have multiple transport authority boundaries and pretty large distances between our communities and destinations. This creates quite a lot of problems in terms of traffic congestion, carbon emissions, transport poverty, and really sort of inequality of access to some of our kind of special landscapes really. So transport is key to many of our environmental, social and economic goals. From a strategic perspective, there are 2 kind of key documents that are really sort of driving this new area of work around transport. I'm not going to go into the detail of these because it would take up the whole presentation, but it's just really to highlight that the Trossachs Explorer is just one example of our ongoing efforts to provide that sustainable travel options to people, reduce the congestion and ease sort of parking pressures and help people access the national park. So this has really been one of our first projects announced as part of the new National Park Partnership Plan, which really sort of sets out a long-term vision for the National Park as a thriving place that is nature positive and carbon negative, with more sustainable transport to and around the park playing an important role here. So the key outcome for this area of work is that by 2045, the National Park will have an inclusive, low carbon travel network, and we have 3 objectives which set out how this will be achieved. So objective 1 is focused on developing new partnership and financial arrangements with our strategic transport partners, of which we have quite a few. We've got 4 local authorities, we have 3 regional transport partners, and national supporters like Transport Scotland and Visit Scotland. Objective 2 is about delivering new transport services and incentives that give people the choice to travel. And this is where the Trossachs Explorer sits as an action. And objective 3 is about growing that transport sector in terms of jobs, skills, capacity to be able to deliver at scale. So that's really sort of quick summary of the background to this work. There's obviously quite big ambition here, which will inevitably take us time to develop and deliver as we go. So in the meantime, we feel it's important to try and deliver where we can, sort of grow that momentum, understand what works, what doesn't work, particularly in this kind of concept, and really push the boundary of what's possible. And one way to do that is obviously to pilot initiatives. And we've been fortunate to have been involved in delivering a few pilots over the last few years, including the Trossachs Explorer. So the purpose of the Trossachs Explorer pilot was really to sort of understand appetite for sustainable travel and to learn about how a bus service might operate in an area like the Trossachs, which is not currently connected by public transport. Initially, we had quite a few challenges to overcome to secure a bus operator and generate enough funding to deliver. Particularly around the bus operator landscape, we had many challenges around location of depots to the route, availability of drivers, the size of vehicles, and a little bit of scepticism, I'd say, about the sort of uptake from passengers and what this service could look like in the future. We were looking to run the service 7 days, Monday to Sunday, across the peak season. The service was to connect communities of Aberfoyle and Callander with popular destinations across the east of the park. That includes campsites, walking trails, hiking routes, cafes, hotels, outdoor attractions. So we really took a sort of service design approach, focusing on the user, their experience, their sort of journey as they were travelling, and designing this around a mixture of residents, businesses and visitors. As we don't have the expertise in-house, we had to secure support from our local authority partner, Stirling Council, who provided the sort of technical expertise, particularly around timetabling, registration of the service, interrogating that bus data, and really sort of holding the operator to account over punctuality and reliability, which is obviously really sort of vital in an area where there's just no other alternatives. So it's really been a steep learning curve for everyone involved over the last 2 years through the development phase into delivery. So in the first year, back in 2024, we managed to secure our first bus operator, really after sort of 3 years of trying, and a lot of what could be delivered was really influenced by what the operator could do. So we managed to secure 2 36-seater buses, really shuttling back and forth between an 11-mile route up to 8 times a day, with a slightly limited service on a Sunday. And quite a key aspect of the pilot was to fully brand the bus stops, the timetables, so that this would really sort of stand out and be as attractive as possible for as many passengers. Some of the key highlights, just before I pass over to Jane and to Sam, we saw just over 5,000 passengers travel on the service across 13 weeks in 2024. Just over half of those passengers travelled for free through the National Entitlement Card. That's for over 60s and under 22s in Scotland. We had support from just over 70 businesses and community organisations, really helping us to sort of promote, but also flagging up where there was issues and being able to adapt to the sort of needs. About 97% of services ran as scheduled. We did have a few issues in our first year with buses breaking down. There were 16 drivers trained to operate the route, and critically we had support from our National Park volunteer rangers, who really were sort of our support on the ground, interacting with passengers on a kind of daily basis and gathering feedback. So I'll hand over to Jane and to Sam, who will talk you through the sort of evaluation approach, really sort of understanding the pilot's impact in the first year, and then I'll sort of jump on to talk about the evolution into year 2.
Yeah, hi everyone. So we were commissioned to evaluate the pilot to try and understand that appetite of the Trossachs Explorer, how it performed as a sustainable rural transport intervention, particularly in terms of the tourism benefits, accessibility, behaviour change, and the wider environmental and community benefits as well. So we wanted to try and capture perspectives from a range of stakeholders. So I'm just going to summarise our approach and some of the key findings that come out of that. So we used a mixed method design. I'll focus on the qualitative elements of the evaluation, while my colleague will focus on the sort of survey and ticket data part of it. There was also open questions, qualitative data within the survey itself. And so we have this really rich data set. If any of you look at the report, there's a whole bunch of appendices with that information in there. Could I have the next slide, please? So yeah, I'll focus specifically on the interviews, the diaries and the QETSO workshop and what these tell us about people's lived experiences of the service. And across all of this material, we used thematic analysis. So we combined manual coding with software-assisted analysis. And that was to try and identify recurring patterns and sort of tensions in the data. We conducted 29 semi-structured interviews, and that was with 32 participants, so some small groups. These included users of the service, non-users as well, so trying to understand barriers to uptake, and also a range of strategic stakeholders, including local authorities, transport providers, community organisations and businesses as well. And many of the participants were recruited actually through our survey. So we had an initial question where anyone who didn't want to fill out the survey could enter their email address, and then we would contact them for interview. Or they could also enter their email address at the end if they wanted to elaborate more in an interview. We also had some stakeholders recommended by Emily, the National Park, who had expressed willingness to participate. So the interviews really allowed us participants to reflect in detail on their experiences. So it's not just the bus itself, but also planning the journeys, connecting with other transport links, how the service fitted into their journeys, and also their lives in this rural context. Second, we drew on observational and diary data collected by the volunteer rangers while they were supporting passengers on the service. And these short reflections captured summaries of some of the interactions or observations, quite useful for sort of informal feedback, understanding first-time experiences, issues, challenges, and just filling in some of the gaps that might not have surfaced from interviews. And you'll see that's me and Sam on the bus trying it out one day when we went to go on the paddle steamer at Loch Lomond. Next slide, please. So finally, we ran a QETSO workshop with 11 of the volunteer rangers. And this was quite useful for reflections, another way to capture data that might not have been picked up elsewhere. So QETSO is essentially a structured visual form of a focus group. Participants work around a shared mat, like you'll see in the image there, using these coloured leaves to capture ideas. We asked them about their challenges, about the opportunities that they came across. And the benefit of this approach is that it encourages equal participation. So it's not just about, in focus groups, it's often one person or two people talking. But this makes everyone has to write their ideas on these leaves. And it makes the discussion kind of tangible, so it produces a visual record of shared thinking, I suppose. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'll now just highlight some 4 key themes that consistently emerged across the qualitative data. So enhanced access to nature. So one of the strongest themes was the way that the service changed access to the national park. So for many users, particularly non-drivers, older visitors, those without access to their own transport, or maybe less confident on these rural roads, the bus made visits to places possible that simply weren't before. So people spoke about repeatedly being able to reach remote trailheads, complete linear walks without car shuttling, and visit places like Loch Lomond for the first time. So importantly, this wasn't just about convenience, it was about choice and about inclusion. Several participants described deliberately planning walking around the bus, knowing it allowed them to explore more ambitiously without that logistical stress of having the car with them. The second major theme relates to sustainability and modal shift. So many users explicitly framed the Trossachs Explorer as a way to leave the car at home, even when they owned one. They talked about displaced car journeys, reduced congestion on these sensitive routes like the Duke's Pass, which it goes over, and the alignment of the service with their personal values as well, so their feelings about the environment. And what's interesting here is that the bus wasn't just seen as this transport option. For some, it made sustainable behaviour feel more practical, more legitimate, and low risk in this context where a car is often assumed to be unavoidable. A third theme was the social and community dimension of the service. So there was some really moving conversations. Users described the bus as connecting them with friends that they hadn't been able to visit very easily, even though they lived fairly close by. The bus itself was seen as a social space, somewhere where you chatted with the drivers, you met other walkers, you ran into people you knew. And this was really significant for some that we spoke to who were living on their own or without other options. We spoke to a charity group as well that take members with learning disabilities on trips, and they spoke about how much they enjoyed the experience. It gave them an opportunity to link up with other public transport to have a nice day out, and they kept using that service while it was available. And then from a sort of more tourism perspective, the service supported local businesses, especially cafes and tea rooms and villages along that route. It brought in new business. People described structuring their walks around stopping for food and coffee, and that obviously brings economic benefits to these businesses. And stakeholders also highlighted a sense of community pride. The bus was visible, it was professionally branded, it symbolised investment in sustainable access rather than car-led tourism. Next slide, please. So alongside the positives, the data illustrated some barriers as well. So the most significant issues were integration with other public transport, so connections to places like Stirling and Glasgow. There were concerns about reliability and trust, especially in this rural setting where missing a bus can feel quite high risk. And timing and seasonality. Many participants wanted earlier start so they could, begin walk longer operating periods or year-round services. Non-users often supported the idea of the service, but felt it required too much planning, or it couldn't be trusted enough to replace the flexibility of the car. So while there was a conceptual support there wasn't always a practical adoption. And these are just some of the nuances that qualitative research draws out. So to conclude, the qualitative findings, they show that the Trossachs Explorer was much more than a bus service. It functioned as an enabler of access, a mechanism for behaviour change, and a connector between people, places and communities. And at the same time, the data highlighted where future iterations need to focus, especially around integration, reliability and visibility. So I'll now hand over to Sam, who will take you through the survey and the ticket data.
Thank you, Jane. So when we look at the quantitative and ticket data findings alongside the qualitative insights you've just heard, you'll see that we've got a bit more of a rounded picture of both the experience and the behaviour. So the survey was delivered online using Qualtrics, and this ran from the middle of July through to the end of October 2024. And access to the survey was primarily through a QR code, and this was shared at bus stops and by volunteer rangers during the pilot. And this was alongside online promotion as well. So this helped us to capture feedback from people who were actively engaging with the service. And then it was also possible to gain that feedback from those who were aware of it but chose not to use it, or those who maybe saw it in passing at some of the bus stops or the car parks along the route. After data cleaning, we analysed 195 valid responses. So when I say after data cleaning, I mean anything that had maybe 25% or more missing responses, we excluded from that analysis. And while this was a quantitative data set, as Jane mentioned before, the survey also included some open-ended questions. So this gave us a little bit more of a qualitative insight on top that complemented the interview findings. So around 2/3 of the respondents had used the Trossachs Explorer on their most recent trip. And for many of these respondents, it was their first time using the service and reflecting engagement with new and distinctive transport offer available in the national park. So next slide, please. So in terms of who responded, the survey does point to the user profile being particularly relevant for rural and sustainable transport planning. Most respondents were based in Scotland, indicating a strong local and regional user base rather than heavy reliance on international visitors. And travel was most commonly reported at weekends, particularly Saturdays. It's important for us to note, though, at the same time that this might reflect in part the engagement activity and the volunteer presence, and when that was most visible rather than usage patterns alone. But in combination with the ticket data, it does align with the Saturday, although the Wednesday was also quite popular. In terms of group composition, people most commonly travelled either in pairs or alone. And this aligns with the qualitative findings as well around walking, leisure trips and social use of the bus rather than larger group travel. The age profile skewed towards middle-aged and older adults, and there was a notable proportion of respondents who were over the age of 60. And this is particularly relevant when thinking about accessibility, confidence, the role of concessionary travel in supporting mobility in rural contexts, and I'll come back to that as part of the findings as well. So next slide, please. The survey responses clearly show that the Trossachs Explorer was primarily used for nature-based and leisure activities. There were quite a lot of people that we spoke to in the survey that were using it for travel to and from work as well, though. The most common reasons for visiting the national park, as stated by those using the Trossachs Explorer or those who were surveyed in the car parks, was enjoying the scenery and landscape, walking and hill walking, visiting lochs, and seeking peace and relaxation. And these findings strongly reinforce the qualitative themes around access to nature, linear walking opportunities, and the role of the service in enabling trips that would otherwise be difficult without a car. In terms of awareness, people most often found out about the service through social media and word of mouth, and this is followed by Tourist Information Centre, and the National Park website. And this suggests that while marketing did work, it did rely heavily on informal and digital channels, and this might help explain why awareness emerged as a barrier for some non-users as well. Sorry, next slide, please. So in terms of, oh, sorry, I've jumped too early ahead. Sorry, Emily. So the survey also included a series of scaled questions, and I think there was a question that came up about the format. So the questionnaire was put on Qualtrics, which is a survey software program, and included a list of scaled and non-scaled questions, as well as open-ended qualitative questions. The scaled questions were analysed using a regression analysis, and this was to understand what predicted overall judgment of the service as well as likelihood of future use. The overall judgment of the Trossachs Explorer was very positive, and the average score was 6.46 out of 7, so very high if we were looking at an average scale mean score. The strongest positive predictors that we found were a lack of alternative transport options, but also the ability to try the service. And this was really important as it suggested the service worked really well, given it filled that genuine gap that was missing in the area, and people felt that they were able to test it without a significant risk or commitment to the service. At the same time, there were two factors that influenced overall judgment and likelihood of use around concerns about reliability and perceptions that the service might be difficult to learn or use, and that just comes down to the marketing of the service. But it mirrors the qualitative findings around trust, planning burden, and confidence in rural transport. And even when people like the idea of the service, that's about reliability and ease of the use, reducing the appeal with the non-users, but that changed once the service was up and running for quite a while. So taken together, the findings suggest that the future use is less about introducing entirely new features, more about reinforcing the confidence and the clarity. And now we can move on to the ticket data. Thank you, Emily. So finally, with the ticket data, this looks at providing an objective picture of how the service was actually used over the pilot period. So as Emily mentioned before, there were more than 5,000 passenger journeys recorded. The most heavily used boarding points were Callender, Loch Katrine and Aberfoyle. And this reinforced their role as key access hubs for both visitors and local users. Adult and concession tickets dominated the use, with concessionary travel accounting for a substantial proportion of journeys, and this was mentioned earlier as well by Emily. This also aligns closely with the age profile seen in the survey, and highlights the importance of affordability and supporting rural mobility. Lower usage at some of the locations, such as Balfron, points to the opportunities around integration, visibility, and service design, rather than an absence of demand. So the demand was there. And next slide, please. So in conclusion, the survey and the ticket data, they strongly reinforce what we heard in the qualitative research, but also that the service met a real need. It supported sustainable and leisure-focused travel and was particularly valued, especially with alternatives being limited. At the same time, it reinforced evidence that reliability, integration, and ease of use were all very critical in terms of uptake. But taken together, again, these findings provide strong evidence base to inform ongoing conversations around how services like the Trossachs Explorer might evolve and be strengthened over time. Thank you, Emma.
Great, thanks, Jane and Sam. So moving into sort of year two, we obviously learned lots through year one, but the challenge was to try and get the bus back on the road during year two. I suppose faced with similar challenges over funding and operator availability, but armed with that strong evaluation report that Jane and Sam just talked through. So the aim of year two was to really sort of build on the momentum, make improvements based on that feedback, and strengthen the case for the service becoming a permanent fixture within the network. So still very much a pilot, but trying to move the conversation forward about how we make this a permanent service. So specifically, we went from having limited interest from operators over the last couple of years to having 2 in the running, which meant we could go out and procure through a competitive process. We had support from more local and regional funding partners, including being awarded funding from one of our local communities, which really sort of showed their commitment and opportunity to get involved and become a partner. And due to the operator that we procured, firstly, we were able to use much more modern buses. They were slightly smaller, 18-seater, but they were much more lower emission and appropriate for the route than we had in year one. And we also decided to have a third bus on standby, really to try and help boost that reliability aspect and capacity on sort of busier days, although this ultimately increased the cost of the operation itself. And secondly, we were able to extend the route to Drimmen, meaning the bus actually shuttled back and forth over a 20-mile route, providing a direct link between the Trossachs area of the park and opening that into East Loch Lomond, which again doesn't really exist, and also allowed us to kind of integrate with train connections. So they were the sort of critical changes that we made from year one. Again, responding to that feedback, we improved some of the bus stops, working with businesses to install new infrastructure, making these more visible, and some more informal stops, particularly which could be used as from a hail and ride perspective. So not necessarily timetabled stops, but areas where people could flag the bus down as long as it was safe to do so. We also spent a bit of time with drivers in advance of the service starting, really sort of recognising their role and the significance that they played during year one, ensuring that they felt more supported and knowledgeable about the area, connecting them into businesses and into communities. So the middle picture there is a couple of drivers from McCall's, our bus operator, who went out on one of the steamship operations on Loch Lomond, really to understand the business and learn more about the area. So the impact that the drivers can have on the success of a service like this, really can't be underestimated. From interacting with passengers to learning about travel patterns, they are the sort of face of the bus. A big part of the communications campaign in year two was to try and improve our integration of the service with connecting journeys as much as possible. We don't want people to drive to the kind of key communities around Drimmen, Aberfoyle, Callander to use the Trossachs Explorer, but to be able to use sustainable travel for as much of their journey as possible. So within the leaflets and the timetables, we tried to incorporate as many bus, rail, water links so passengers could really plan for this better, as well as work with other operators to promote through their own channels. As many of you will know, aligning timetables by different operators is almost impossible. So there's still quite a long way to go on this one to make sure that it works better. But we have started that conversation, and particularly in this area where you really don't have an awful lot of choice, it's really important that they all align. In terms of the impact within year two, to be honest, we could talk about this for ages. There is an evaluation report, not quite as robust as Jane and Sam's from 2024, but there is one coming for last year's operation. But just some headlines here. So we saw about a 15% increase in passenger numbers from year one, which is pretty significant, really. We think mainly because we were able to extend that route. It opened up a different part of the national park, but we also had something to build on, particularly from a sort of communication and a marketing perspective. Similar to 2024, we saw high levels of satisfaction, return use, and quite critically, growing confidence in public transport. 90% said that this Trossachs Explorer had increased their confidence in public transport. So I think that's a really good kind of key takeaway. Reliability was almost at 100%. We had no breakdowns through the use of the kind of more modern vehicles compared to 2024, and I think that's really important in terms of trying to build that confidence in people's ability to turn up at the bus stop and the bus is going to pick them up. We quite a lot of high support for the improvements made since year one, particularly improved reliability, quality of vehicles, and those kind of better connections. But as I mentioned before, integration could always be better. And I suppose feedback really sort of demonstrates clear benefits of car-free access, rural mobility, that social interaction, and workplace travel. So similar themes to those that were identified in year one, but sort of great to see that coming back up again. So I think the Trossachs Explorer has kind of shown how a well-designed, good quality bus service can support rural communities. It can boost the local economy, and it can create those memorable visitor experiences. And given the kind of sort of clear and continued support for the service, we are trying to secure its return this year, working towards this becoming a permanent service within the network that runs hopefully all year round. At the moment, because it's just peak season, so there are lots of opportunities, but there's some challenges around this. So first one there is around sort of long-term plan, is to unlock revenue within the system, particularly from car park income, from ticket sales, from things like visitor levies, which is obviously a bit of a hot topic and one that's causing a lot of debate, but obviously opportunities there. And then look to sort of reinvest some of that revenue back into the transport system. That would enable us to kind of move away from relying on annual funding, which makes it really difficult to be able to plan these services without much notice, get them integrated into marketing of businesses, but that will obviously take time to develop. So in the meantime, we are really reliant on that annual funding. Secondly, it'll be interesting to know if there's other discussions in different parts of the country. We're having a debate at the moment between delivering a service that fits a budget line, or whether we look to try and bring in more investment into the system to deliver high quality services. There's, I suppose, pros and cons of each approach, but we believe if we want to see significant modal shift, particularly around visitors to the national park, we need to have reliable, high frequency and quality transport services. As I mentioned before, there's a need to improve our integration, particularly between different modes. So looking at the sort of timetable between operators, have capacity on buses for bikes. That's a big need of our local community, as well as looking at the pricing of tickets. We don't have a fare cap in Scotland, so the cost of a single ticket can sometimes be higher than a day ticket, which just creates barriers for people using the service. There's growing interest from operators, which I think is a great indication of the increasing credibility of the service. But there are ongoing challenges around the sort of operational cost, and especially around sort of vehicle availability, particularly ones that are more modern, reliable, and lower emission, which is what we're trying to aim for. There's opportunities to look at the sort of long-term ownership of these types of services, and we've been fortunate to work with good operators the last couple of years, but there's quite a bit of work up in Scotland happening around sort of bus franchising, municipal operations within councils. So there's opportunity to look at that landscape as well. And finally, just a quick one there, the transport network in the east of the park is really developing quite well, we feel, and the Trossachs Explorer has played a part in this. But there's also new bus links that are being created. We've got a great new operator in Ember, which is running sort of coach tours connecting the whole of Scotland, and they're creating new links which connects into the Trossachs Explorer quite well. We have water services, which is an area that we're looking to develop a lot further. We've got our local councils are looking at demand responsive transport, connecting in more communities, initiatives for active travel. So I think it demonstrates the value of partnership working when we can try and align all these different opportunities together and what they can do. So finally, just before we wrap up, hopefully I've got enough time. Just a wee short video clip here, just to hear a little bit more directly from our bus driver from last year, and passengers to understand the impact that this service has had a little bit better. Sorry, just finally from myself, thanks again for having us. A couple of links on the final slide there. we're always open to being an area for piloting services or innovations, research opportunities, funding partners. So do get in touch if this has sparked an idea in your mind. And yeah, happy to open up for discussion. Thanks very much.